Chapter 2. The First Dispersion. Assyria and the Northern 10 Tribes. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria, and carried Israel away to Assyria, and placed them in Hala, and by the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 6. That single verse changed everything. The northern 10 tribes, the house of Ephraim, were uprooted from their land, relocated to the far edges of the Assyrian Empire, and scattered into history. Most people stop reading there. They assume the story ended. 10 tribes taken, 10 tribes lost. But God had already spoken through Amos before it happened, that not one grain would fall to the ground. The story did not end in Assyria. It continued northward, westward, across continents and centuries and oceans, until it arrived exactly where God said it would. That is what chapter 2 is about, the trail of the scattered seed, and what it left behind. The Assyrian captivity of 722 BC is not merely a biblical record. It is one of the best documented events in ancient Near Eastern history, confirmed by multiple independent sources outside of Scripture. Sargon II, the Assyrian king who completed the campaign, left his own royal annals recovered from Khorsabad. In those annals, he records the deportation of 27,290 Israelites in the initial campaign alone. He was not modest about it. It was a trophy of empire. But notice what the Assyrian records do not say. They do not say the Israelites were destroyed. They do not say they were absorbed into the Assyrian population and ceased to exist. They were relocated, placed in specific regions at the edges of the empire: Hala, the Habor, the river of Gozan, the cities of the Medes. The scripture then records something equally significant. None left but the tribe of Judah only. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 18. This is the scriptural confirmation that the northern kingdom was entirely removed. Not partially displaced, entirely removed. And then, silence. The northern tribes do not appear in the Babylonian restoration of 538 BC. They did not come back with Zerubbabel. They did not return with Ezra. Their story continued somewhere else entirely. The apocryphal book of 2nd Esdras preserves a tradition about what happened next, that the 10 tribes took counsel among themselves to leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt. Whether that represents literal historical memory or literary idealization, it points in the same direction the physical evidence points: northward, into the unknown, away from the settled empires, into the wild lands beyond the Caucasus. The migration corridor of the displaced northern tribes is traceable not through a single dramatic announcement, but through multiple independent streams of evidence that all point the same direction. Moving northward through the Caucasus mountain passes into the Black Sea steppe region, the displaced Israelites entered the territory that Greek historians knew as Scythia, a vast region stretching from modern Ukraine and southern Russia westward toward the Carpathian Mountains. The Scythians themselves are a remarkable people in the historical record. They appeared in that region suddenly, with a sophistication of religious practice and burial custom that historians have long noted bore striking similarities to ancient Near Eastern, specifically Semitic, traditions. They were not a people who emerged slowly from the local population. They arrived. From Scythia, the westward migration moved through multiple corridors into the Celtic lands of Gaul, Iberia, Britain, and Ireland, and into the Germanic and Anglo-Saxon peoples who would eventually shape Western civilization. This migration was not a single event. It was a centuries-long process, with different tribal remnants arriving at different times through different routes. But what the linguistic evidence, the migration chronology, the cultural parallels, and the prophetic framework share is a consistent directional pattern: north and west, away from the ancient Near East, toward the coastlands and the islands of the sea, toward the Atlantic, toward the land God was preparing, northward, into the unknown, away from the settled empires, into the wild lands beyond the Caucasus. Among the most traceable of the northern tribes in the westward migration is Dan. Dan was a seafaring, place-naming people, and their characteristic signature is the Dan root appearing in geographic names across Europe in a trail that follows the migration corridor with remarkable precision. Look at what they left behind. The Danube River, the great waterway of Central Europe, bearing the root Dan from its earliest recorded name. Denmark, literally, the land of the Dan-ear, the Danes. The Dnieper River in Ukraine, recorded in ancient sources as Danapris. The Don River in Russia, carrying the Scythian root Dan. Dundee in Scotland, the fort of the Dan tribal settlement. And Ireland itself, whose ancient name Era connects to the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of Dan. One thread does not prove the case. A single linguistic parallel could be coincidental, but when the linguistic trail is overlaid on the migration chronology, when the Dan root appears precisely in the regions and at the times the northern migration corridor would predict, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to dismiss. The people who named the rivers and the headlands as they moved through a continent were not anonymous wanderers. They were carrying an identity, even as the name attached to that identity changed over generations. Dan's prophetic role in this story is not merely geographic, it is functional. Dan is the tribe that consistently appears at the edges of great movements, the defenders, the unexpected providers of strength. As we will see in chapter 5, the descendants of Dan played a defining role in the most critical moment of America's covenantal history. Before we leave the first dispersion, we must hear what God said over the northern tribes at the very moment of their scattering, because it is precisely this word that the reconciliation regathering fulfills. The prophet Amos, writing in the generation before the Assyrian captivity, recorded one of the most extraordinary promises in all of Scripture. For surely I will command, and will sift the house of Israel among all nations, as grain is sifted in a sieve, yet not the smallest grain shall fall to the ground. Amos chapter 9, verse 9. The sifting was total. Every grain was scattered. The northern tribes were dispersed across the known world. None returned in the Babylonian restoration. They moved through Scythia, through Celtic Europe, through the British Isles, across the Atlantic. But not one grain was lost. The God who scattered Israel with the precision of an Assyrian military campaign preserved every grain through centuries of journey. The scattering was not the abandonment of the covenant. It was the distribution of the seed, so that when the final harvest came, it would come from every corner of the earth. Think about what that means. The northern tribes were scattered, but purposefully, precisely, with a sovereign hand that tracked every grain and guaranteed that not one would fall to the ground uncounted. This was not tragedy mismanaged by providence. This was providence executing a plan that required the seed to reach every nation on earth, so that no nation would be without it when the day of regathering came. To understand the Amos promise in its fullest depth, we must understand what the prophet meant by grain. In Scripture, the grain is never merely a crop statistic. It is the primary metaphor for life itself, the visible vessel that contains and expresses life. But every grain contains within it a seed, the invisible blueprint, the word made molecular, the genetic code that determines what the grain will become. The grain is the visible form. The seed is the invisible pattern that makes the form possible. This is God's architecture of preservation, operating on two dimensions simultaneously. The visible dimension. The peoples bearing the covenant name would not be completely annihilated. Communities would survive even in dispersion. Families would continue. The testimony would persist in some form across every generation. The invisible dimension, the genetic inheritance, the DNA blueprint carrying the biological signature of the covenant people, would be preserved intact through the sifting. No matter how far the grain traveled, no matter how many generations passed, no matter how many names changed, the seed within the grain could not be corrupted or lost. The molecular word written into every cell would carry forward the identity of the people God had chosen. This is why the genetic evidence we possess today is not incidental to the prophecy. It is the fulfillment of it. The McCowan modal haplotype, a specific genetic marker associated with the ancient Israelite priestly lineage, appears in both Ashkenazi Jewish populations and in African diaspora populations at statistically significant rates. It should not be there by any conventional historical explanation, but it is there. God did not merely preserve memory, He preserved code. He did not merely keep a story alive, He kept a people alive, written into their very biology. The seed cannot be lost because the God who planted it is faithful. What makes the case for the northern tribes' westward migration compelling is not any single line of evidence. It is the convergence. 4 independent streams of evidence, archaeological, linguistic, genetic, and prophetic, all flowing toward the same conclusion. The archaeological evidence shows cultural continuities between ancient Near Eastern burial practice, religious custom, and social organization appearing in Scythian and later Celtic populations patterns in ways that defy simple cultural diffusion. These were not borrowed customs, they were carried customs. The linguistic evidence, the Dan route across European geography, Semitic loanwords embedded in Celtic languages, place name patterns that follow the migration corridor, forms a trail that is too consistent and too directional to be coincidental. The genetic evidence, the Cohen modal haplotype appearing where it should not appear by conventional history, genetic clustering patterns in Celtic and Anglo-Saxon populations that show unexpected ancient Near Eastern markers, points to a biological continuity preserved across millennia. And the prophetic evidence, Amos 9:9, Isaiah 11:11-12, Hosea 1:10, Ezekiel 37, describes exactly this kind of total dispersion followed by total regathering. Not a spiritual metaphor, a literal, physical, geographic movement of real people to real places, gathered again by a real God at a real moment in history. One thread alone could be dismissed. 4 threads, woven together, form a cord. The northern tribes did not disappear, they moved, carrying the seed, carrying the covenant, carrying, though they did not know it, the destiny of a nation not yet born. The seed cannot be lost because the God who planted it is faithful. Chapter 2 has traced the first dispersion. The northern 10 tribes taken by Assyria in 722 BC, relocated, not destroyed, moving northward through the Caucasus, into Scythia, into Celtic Europe, into the British Isles, across the Atlantic, carrying the seed, leaving the linguistic trail, preserved by the God who sifted every grain with sovereign precision. When Judah looks at Ephraim across the centuries, across the ocean, and recognizes the same genetic markers, the same cultural signatures, the same covenant pattern expressing itself through different vessels, that recognition is not mere speculation. It is the fulfillment of Amos 9:9 becoming visible. The grain was scattered, but the seed within the grain, the invisible inheritance, the word written into their very biology, was sifted without loss. The scattering was not the end of the story. In chapter 3, we will follow the story further, into the specific prophecy of Genesis 48, into the double blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh, and into the most remarkable geographic identification in all of Scripture. England and America, one seed, 2 families, one nation under God. The key is still in your hand. Let us keep reading.